In the autumn of 1902, a fire consumed the Mercy Ridge Orphanage in rural Kentucky, revealing a secret that had been carefully guarded for 7 years. What authorities discovered in the ashes would expose a network of lies that stretched from the coal mines of Harlan County to the elegant parlors of Lexington's elite. This is the story of how one institution became a hiding place for the children society refused to acknowledge, the girls they called the Devil's Daughters. The Mercy Ridge Orphanage sat 3 miles outside the town of Colebrook, Kentucky, perched on a hillside where the autumn mist gathered thick as wool every morning. From the road below, travelers could see its grey stone walls and narrow windows, but few ever ventured up the winding path that led to its iron gates. The locals spoke of it rarely, and when they did, their voices dropped to whispers. It was a place for unwanted children, they said, and nothing more needed to be said about unwanted things. Thomas Brennan arrived in Colebrook on October 15, 1902, carrying a leather satchel and a letter of introduction from the Kentucky State Board of Charities. He was 32 years old, a former seminary student who had abandoned his religious calling to become an inspector of charitable institutions. His job required him to visit orphanages, poorhouses, and asylums across the state, documenting their conditions and ensuring they met minimum standards of care. Most of the time, the work was tedious, reviewing ledgers, counting beds, interviewing matrons who offered rehearsed answers to predictable questions. But Mercy Ridge was different. Brennan had heard rumors about the place from other inspectors, whispered concerns that never made it into official reports. The orphanage received substantial private funding, yet it housed fewer than 40 children. Its director, a woman named Constance Ridley, had connections to some of Kentucky's wealthiest families, but she kept no social ties in Colebrook itself. And most puzzling of all, the orphanage accepted only girls between the ages of 10 and 17, a peculiar restriction that had no clear explanation. Brennan walked up the hill that afternoon, with his collar turned up against the October chill. The trees along the path had already shed most of their leaves, and the bare branches rattled in the wind like bones. When he reached the gates, he found them locked. He rang the bell 3 times before a thin woman in a grey dress appeared on the other side of the bars. She studied him through the iron scrollwork, her face expressionless. "We don't receive visitors without an appointment," she said. Brennan held up his letter. "I'm from the State Board of Charities. I sent word 2 weeks ago that I'd be conducting an inspection." The woman's jaw tightened, but she unlocked the gate and pulled it open just wide enough for him to pass through. "Mrs. Ridley is occupied. You'll have to wait in the receiving room." The interior of Mercy Ridge matched its exterior. Cold stone walls, narrow corridors, and a perpetual dampness that seemed to seep from the very foundation. The woman led Brennan to a small room furnished with a single wooden chair and a table bare of any decoration. She closed the door behind him without another word, and he heard the soft click of a lock turning. Brennan set his satchel on the table and walked to the window. From this vantage point, he could see the orphanage's central courtyard, a rectangular space enclosed by 3-story wings on all sides. A dozen girls moved across the yard in 2 straight lines, their heads bowed, their hands clasped behind their backs. They wore identical grey dresses and white caps, and they marched in complete silence. An older woman with a rod in her hand stood watching them, tapping the rod against her palm in a steady rhythm. 40 minutes passed before the door opened again. Constance Ridley entered the room like winter itself, tall, sharp-featured, dressed entirely in black. Her hair was pulled back so severely that it seemed to stretch the skin across her temples, and her eyes were the color of slate. "Mr. Brennan," Ridley said, her voice carrying the cultivated accent of Kentucky's upper class. "Your letter arrived, but I'm afraid this is an inconvenient time for an inspection. 2 of our girls are ill with fever, and we're managing a crisis in the kitchen. Perhaps you could return next month when circumstances are more favorable." Brennan remained standing. "Mrs. Ridley, state law requires that charitable institutions submit to regular inspections without advance notice of the specific date. I've traveled 3 days to reach Colebrook, and I intend to fulfill my duties today." Something flickered in Ridley's expression. Not quite fear, but a calculation, a rapid weighing of options. She walked to the window and looked out at the courtyard where the girls continued their silent march. When she spoke again, her voice had softened, taking on a tone of weary resignation. Very well. However, I must insist that you limit your inspection to the administrative records and the common areas. The girls' dormitories are off limits during the afternoon rest period. We have strict rules about maintaining their privacy and routine. Brennan opened his satchel and withdrew a notebook and pencil. I'll need to interview at least a dozen of your residents, privately. It's standard procedure. Ridley turned from the window and her eyes narrowed. That won't be possible. Our girls come from difficult circumstances. Many of them are deeply troubled. Unfamiliar visitors cause them considerable distress, and we've worked hard to establish trust and discipline. I won't have their progress disrupted by unnecessary interrogations. Mrs. Ridley, Brennan said carefully, what exactly do you mean by difficult circumstances? For a long moment, Ridley said nothing. In the silence, Brennan could hear the wind outside, and somewhere deeper in the building the sound of girls singing. A hymn, though he couldn't make out the words. Finally, Ridley walked back to the door and closed it, ensuring they wouldn't be overheard. The girls we house at Mercy Ridge are not ordinary orphans, Mr. Brennan. They are the daughters of prostitutes, criminals, and the morally degenerate. Children born out of wedlock to women of the lowest character. Society has deemed them corrupted by their very blood, tainted by the sins of their mothers. The people of Kentucky call them the devil's daughters, and most institutions refuse to take them in. We offer them sanctuary and moral instruction, but we do so away from the eyes of decent people. That is our sacred mission. Brennan wrote this down, his pencil moving steadily across the page. And who funds this mission? Your records show substantial monthly donations, but the sources aren't specified. Ridley's expression hardened. Our benefactors prefer to remain anonymous. They are respectable people who wish to do good works without drawing attention to themselves or their association with such unfortunate children. I'll still need to see the financial records, Brennan said. The law requires full transparency in charitable institutions that claim tax exemptions. Ridley's hands clenched at her sides. Mr. Brennan, I wonder if you understand the delicate nature of our work here. These girls are being given a second chance at a decent life. We teach them discipline, piety, and useful domestic skills. When they turn 18, we place them in respectable households as servants, or in factories where they can earn honest wages. Without Mercy Ridge, they would end up on the streets, following their mothers into lives of depravity and crime. That may be true, Brennan said, but it doesn't exempt you from state regulations. I'll begin with your admission records. I want to see documentation for every girl currently in residence, names, ages, circumstances of admission, and the identities of their guardians or next of kin. Ridley's face had gone pale. The records you're requesting don't exist in the form you expect, Ridley said slowly. Many of these girls were abandoned as infants or brought to us by county officials who found them in deplorable conditions. Their mothers are dead, imprisoned, or have disappeared. We have no next of kin to document. Brennan looked up from his notebook. Then you should have documentation from the county officials who transferred them to your care. Names, dates, court orders. Surely you didn't simply accept children off the street without any legal authority. Of course not, Ridley snapped. But the paperwork is kept in a separate location for the protection of the families involved. Some of these girls come from prominent households, the results of indiscretions that would cause terrible scandal if revealed. The fathers are men of standing who have paid handsomely to ensure their mistakes remain hidden. Now they were getting to the truth. Brennan set down his pencil and met Ridley's gaze directly. So Mercy Ridge is not simply an orphanage. It's a hiding place for illegitimate children whose fathers want them kept secret and out of sight. We provide a necessary service, Ridley said, her voice tight with controlled anger. These girls would be killed at birth or left to die of exposure if not for us. We give them life, education, and purpose. Is that so terrible? That depends on how you treat them once they're here, Brennan said. I watched those girls marching in the courtyard. They looked terrified, and I heard the rod tapping. Are you using corporal punishment? We use discipline when necessary to correct behavior and instill obedience. These are not gentle, well-bred children, Mr. Brennan. They come to us wild, defiant, and corrupted by the environments they've known. We must break them of their bad habits and teach them proper Christian values. Brennan felt a cold anger rising in his chest. He had seen this before in other institutions. the justification of cruelty through appeals to morality and religion. I want to speak with the girls now. You can select which ones, but I will interview them privately, or I will return with a court order and sheriff's deputies. Ridley stared at him for a long moment, her jaw working as if she were chewing bitter medicine. Then she walked to the door and opened it. Very well, but I'm warning you, Mr. Brennan, what you learn here will not be what you expect. These girls are liars and manipulators. They've been taught deception from birth by their mothers. Whatever stories they tell you will be designed to gain sympathy and cause trouble. She led him down a narrow corridor to a small parlor furnished with mismatched chairs and a threadbare rug. The walls were bare, except for a wooden cross and a framed embroidery that read, "Blessed are the pure in heart." Ridley left him there and returned 10 minutes later with a girl of about 15. The girl was thin, with dark hair pulled back in a tight braid and eyes that seemed too large for her pale face. She wore the same grey dress and white cap as the others, and her hands were raw and chapped from hard work. She stood in the doorway, not entering until Ridley pushed her forward. "This is Sarah," Ridley said. "She's been with us for 3 years. She'll answer your questions." Ridley moved toward one of the chairs, but Brennan held up his hand. "Privately, Mrs. Ridley, as I said before." Ridley's mouth compressed into a thin line, but she turned and left, closing the door behind her. Brennan gestured to one of the chairs. "Please, sit down, Sarah. You're not in any trouble. I just want to ask you a few questions about your life here at Mercy Ridge." The girl sat on the edge of the chair, her back rigid, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't look at him, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes, sir." "How old are you, Sarah?" 15, sir, I think. Mrs. Ridley says I'm 15. "You think? You don't know for certain?" Sarah shook her head slightly. "I don't remember much from before I came here. I was maybe 12 when they brought me. Mrs. Ridley told me my mother was dead and my father didn't want me. She said I should be grateful for the chance to learn honest work." Brennan wrote this down. "And what kind of work do you do here?" "Laundry, mostly, and kitchen work. We get up at 5 in the morning for prayers, then breakfast, porridge and bread. After that, we work until noon. Then more prayers, lunch, more work until supper. Then evening prayers and bed at 8. "What about education? Are you learning to read and write?" For the first time, Sarah's expression shifted, and Brennan saw something that might have been longing or grief. "We used to have lessons. Miss Porter came 3 times a week to teach us reading and arithmetic, but she stopped coming last spring. Mrs. Ridley said we didn't need book learning. She said our purpose was to serve, not to think." Brennan felt the anger tightening in his chest again. "Sarah, I need you to be honest with me. Are you being hurt here? Are the staff punishing you or the other girls?" Sarah's hands clenched in her lap, and her eyes darted to the door as if she expected Ridley to burst through it at any moment. "Mrs. Ridley says punishment is for our own good. She says we're born with sin in our blood, and it has to be beaten out of us. Miss Howell, she's one of the matrons. She uses a leather strap when we don't work fast enough, or when we talk during meals. And if a girl tries to run away, they lock her in the cellar. Has anyone tried to run away recently?" Sarah nodded, and tears began to slide down her cheeks. "Lucy did. Lucy Brenner, she was 16. She tried to leave 2 months ago because Mrs. Ridley was going to send her to work in a house in Lexington, and Lucy said the man there had a bad reputation. She heard the other girls talking about it, that he took advantage of the servants, so Lucy ran. They caught her on the road to town and brought her back. Mrs. Ridley locked her in the cellar for a week. When they let her out, she was so sick she could barely stand. She had pneumonia from the cold and the damp. She died 3 weeks later." Brennan's pencil stopped moving. "Lucy died? And what happened to her body? Was there a doctor? Was there an inquest?" "Dr. Caldwell came, but he just signed a paper saying she died of natural causes. Mrs. Ridley told us it was God's judgment on Lucy for her disobedience. She made us all stand around the coffin and pray for Lucy's corrupted soul. Then they buried her in the field behind the orphanage. There are 6 graves out there now. 6 girls who've died since I've been here." Brennan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. 6 girls? In 3 years?" Sarah flinched at his sudden movement, but she nodded. "Yes, sir. Lucy, and before her there was Margaret, who got consumption, and Emily, who fell down the stairs. though some of the girls say Miss Howell pushed her because Emily talked back, and 3 others before I learned their names. Mrs. Ridley says weak bodies can't survive moral correction. She says it's proof of their inferior breeding. Brennan's hands trembled as he closed his notebook. The weight of what Sarah had revealed pressed against his chest like a physical force. 6 deaths in 3 years, and no one in Colebrook seemed to know or care. He looked at the girl sitting before him, her thin shoulders hunched, her face streaked with tears, and felt a surge of determination that burned away his earlier caution. "Sarah, I need you to do something for me," he said quietly. "I need you to tell the other girls that I'm going to help you, all of you. But I need evidence, documentation, witnesses, anything that can prove what's happening here. Can you do that?" Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Mrs. Ridley keeps all the important papers locked in her office. There's a big cabinet with a key she wears around her neck. And Dr. Caldwell comes every Tuesday to examine the new girls. He's the one who signs the death certificates when girls die. He gets paid extra for it. I heard Mrs. Ridley telling him once. Do you know where the graves are, the exact location? Behind the laundry building, past the vegetable garden. There's a little field with 6 wooden crosses. No names on them, just numbers. Lucy was number 6. Before Brennan could respond, the door opened and Constance Ridley stepped inside. Her eyes moved from Brennan to Sarah and back again, and her expression darkened. "That's quite enough, Mr. Brennan. Sarah needs to return to her duties. I'm sure you've gathered sufficient information for your report." Brennan stood, tucking his notebook into his jacket. "Actually, Mrs. Ridley, I've only just begun. I'll need to inspect the dormitories, the kitchen, the laundry facilities, and the medical records. I also want to see your financial ledgers and admission documents, and I'll need to examine the burial ground behind the building." Ridley's face went rigid. "The burial ground is private property. You have no authority to disturb it." "I have every authority under Kentucky law to investigate conditions at any charitable institution receiving tax exemptions and state funding," Brennan said. "If you obstruct this investigation, I can return with a court order and law enforcement officers. Is that what you prefer?" For a moment, neither of them moved. Sarah remained frozen in her chair, her eyes wide with fear. Then Ridley's expression shifted, and something like resignation settled across her features. She gestured toward the door. "Very well. I'll take you to the graves first, since you seem so determined to see them. Perhaps then you'll understand what we're dealing with here, the reality of trying to save children who are fundamentally damaged." They walked through the orphanage in silence, Sarah trailing behind them at a distance Ridley insisted upon. The building was even colder inside than Brennan had initially thought, and he noticed that many of the girls they passed wore threadbare shawls over their grey dresses. Their faces were uniformly pale, their eyes downcast. Not one of them looked at him directly. The burial ground was exactly where Sarah had described, a small clearing beyond the vegetable garden, surrounded by a low stone wall. 6 wooden crosses stood in 2 neat rows, each marked with a painted number. The earth over the graves was packed hard, and no flowers or memorial decorations softened their stark appearance. Brennan stood at the edge of the field and felt something cold settle in his stomach. "These girls died of natural causes," Ridley said from behind him. "Consumption, pneumonia, fever. The weak don't survive harsh conditions, Mr. Brennan. It's the way of nature. We did everything we could for them, but their constitutions were already compromised by their mothers' immoral lifestyles, alcohol, disease, malnutrition during pregnancy. We can't undo that damage." "Lucy Brenner died 3 weeks ago," Brennan said without turning around. "That's grave number 6. What about the others? What were their names?" Ridley was silent for a moment. "I don't recall all of them. We keep records, of course, but the names aren't important. What matters is that we tried to save them, to give them a chance at redemption. Some children simply can't be saved." Brennan turned to face her. "Every child can be saved with proper care, adequate food, warmth, and compassion. What I'm seeing here isn't salvation. It's neglect at best and deliberate cruelty at worst. These girls are being worked to exhaustion, underfed and brutalized, and when they die as a result of that treatment, you bury them in unmarked graves and tell yourself it's God's will." Ridley's eyes flashed with anger. "You know nothing about our work here. These girls are the refuse of society, the offspring of whores and criminals. Most institutions won't even accept them. We give them structure, discipline, and purpose. Without Mercy Ridge, they'd be on the streets or dead in a ditch. We're saving souls, Mr. Brennan, even if we can't always save bodies. Saving souls, Brennan repeated, his voice low and hard. Is that what you call it when you beat children with leather straps? When you lock them in cellars until they develop pneumonia? When you work them like slaves from dawn until dark with barely enough food to sustain them? Ridley's hands clenched at her sides. Discipline is not abuse. These girls arrive here wild, defiant, corrupted by their upbringing. They lie, they steal. They exhibit all manner of immoral behavior. We must break them of these habits through firm correction. It's unpleasant, yes, but necessary. The alternative is to let them grow into the same degraded women their mothers were. Brennan pulled out his notebook again. I want the names of every girl who's died here since the orphanage opened. I want the name of the doctor who signed their death certificates. And I want to know the identities of your anonymous benefactors, the men who are paying you to hide their illegitimate daughters. That information is confidential. I'm protecting families from scandal and ruin. Surely you can understand the importance of discretion in such matters. What I understand, Brennan said, is that you're running an institution that exploits vulnerable children, while their wealthy fathers pay for your silence. Those men get to maintain their reputations, while their daughters live in misery and die in obscurity. That's not charity, Mrs. Ridley. That's extortion. Ridley's face flushed red. How dare you? I have devoted my life to this work. I could have lived comfortably in Lexington society, but I chose to serve these unfortunate creatures. I've given them shelter, food, and moral guidance. If some of them lack the strength to survive, that's not my fault. It's the inevitable result of their tainted bloodlines. Then you won't mind if I examine your medical records and financial ledgers. If everything is as proper as you claim, the documentation will support your story. For a long moment, Ridley stood silent, her jaw working as if she were chewing over her options. Finally, she turned toward the orphanage. Follow me. But I warn you, Mr. Brennan, you're making a grave mistake. The men who support this institution are powerful. They won't take kindly to your interference in their private affairs. Is that a threat? It's a fact. You're a minor functionary from a state agency that has no real authority and even less funding. Do you truly believe you can stand against men who control banks, railroads, and political offices? Men who can destroy your career with a single letter to your superiors? Brennan followed her back through the garden and into the orphanage's main building. I believe in the law, Mrs. Ridley, and the law requires that institutions like this one maintain proper standards of care. If you're violating those standards, no amount of wealth or influence will protect you. They entered Ridley's office, a cramped room with a single window overlooking the courtyard. A large oak desk dominated the space, and behind it stood a locked cabinet made of dark wood. Ridley pulled a key from the chain around her neck and opened the cabinet, withdrawing a leather-bound ledger. These are our admission records, she said, placing the book on the desk. You'll find everything documented according to state requirements: names, ages, dates of admission, and circumstances. I keep meticulous records, Mr. Brennan. You'll find nothing improper. Brennan opened the ledger and began reading. The entries were indeed detailed, but as he scanned the pages, a pattern emerged that confirmed his suspicions. Nearly all the girls admitted to Mercy Ridge were listed as foundlings or abandoned, convenient designations that required no documentation of parentage. There were no names of mothers or fathers, no court orders for custody transfers, no signatures from county officials, just brief notes in Ridley's neat handwriting. Admitted by arrangement, father anonymous, mother deceased, or unsuitable. These aren't proper admission records, Brennan said. There's no legal documentation, no verification of the children's identities or circumstances. For all I know, these girls could have been kidnapped. Ridley's expression turned cold. They weren't kidnapped. They were rescued from situations where they faced certain degradation or death. Their fathers, respectable men who made unfortunate mistakes, contacted me through intermediaries. They paid for their daughter's care and placement here. In exchange, I agreed to keep their identities confidential. It's a private arrangement that benefits everyone involved. Everyone except the girls themselves, Brennan said. They're imprisoned here, worked like servants, and denied any chance at a normal life. And when they become inconvenient or try to escape, they end up in unmarked graves. That's not true. We place many of our girls in good positions when they reach 18. They go into domestic service in respectable households, or they find work in factories. We give them the skills they need to support themselves honestly. Brennan flipped through more pages, noting the names and ages. There were currently 37 girls in residence, ranging from age 10 to 17. But the admission record showed that over the past 7 years, more than 60 girls had been brought to Mercy Ridge. Where were the others? What happened to the girls who aren't here anymore? He asked. The ones who were placed in positions or sent to work. Do you have records of where they went? Names and addresses of their employers? Ridley hesitated. Some of that information is incomplete. Not all employers want their names recorded. In other words, you don't know where most of these girls ended up. You could have sold them into brothels or sweatshops, and there'd be no way to trace them. Ridley's face went white with rage. I would never do such a thing. Every girl who leaves this institution goes to a verified position. I personally arrange each placement. Then show me the placement records. Names, addresses, dates of employment. If you're keeping proper records as you claim, that information should be readily available. Ridley reached into the cabinet and withdrew another ledger, this one smaller and bound in black leather. She opened it on the desk, but she kept her hand on the pages as if reluctant to let Brennan see them. These are the placement records, but I must insist that you maintain confidentiality regarding the employers' identities. Many of them are prominent citizens who value their privacy. Brennan pulled the ledger toward him and began reading. The entries were sparse, just names, dates, and cities. No specific addresses, no employer names, no way to verify that any of the placements were legitimate. Several entries simply read, Lexington Household or Louisville Factory with no additional details. And there were troubling gaps. Girls who had been admitted years ago had no placement records at all. They simply disappeared from the documentation. What about these girls? Brennan asked, pointing to a cluster of names from 1897. Mary Sullivan, age 16. Elizabeth Hart, age 15. Catherine Moore, age 17. There's no record of what happened to them. Did they die, were they placed, or did something else happen? Ridley's jaw tightened. Those girls ran away. They left the orphanage without permission and never returned. We reported their disappearances to the local sheriff, but nothing came of it. Runaways are common in institutions like this. Girls get restless. They believe they can make better lives for themselves on their own. Usually they end up exactly where we tried to prevent them from going, into prostitution or worse. Did you actually report these disappearances? Because I'd like to see the sheriff's reports. I'll be visiting the Colebrook Sheriff's Office after I leave here. Something flickered in Ridley's expression, fear, perhaps, or calculation. Sheriff Hoskins is aware of our work here. He understands that some girls are beyond saving. If they choose to run away and destroy themselves, that's their decision, not ours. Brennan made careful notes of the missing girls' names and dates. 3 girls in 1897, 2 more in 1898, 4 in 1899. 9 girls total who had simply vanished from the records with no explanation beyond Ridley's claim that they ran away. Combined with the 6 deaths, that meant 15 girls who had entered Mercy Ridge and never left alive, or with documented placements. I'll need to speak with more of your current residents, Brennan said. I want to interview at least 10 girls privately, and I want to inspect their living quarters, dormitories, washrooms, the kitchen, and the laundry facilities. Ridley closed the ledgers and returned them to the cabinet, locking it with decisive movements. That won't be possible today. It's nearly time for evening prayers and supper. The girls need their routine maintained. Disruptions upset them and lead to behavioral problems. You can return tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, and I'll arrange for additional interviews. But I insist on being present for them. I won't have you filling these girls' heads with false hopes or encouraging them to make accusations. Mrs. Ridley, I'm conducting an official inspection. I don't require your permission for when or how I proceed. And I'm the director of this institution. These girls are under my care and protection. I have a responsibility to ensure their well-being, which includes protecting them from outside interference that could damage their moral development. If you insist on disrupting our evening routine, I'll have no choice but to contact our legal counsel and the members of our board of directors. I assure you, they include several judges and state legislators who will be very interested to hear about your aggressive tactics. Brennan recognized the power play for what it was, an attempt to delay the investigation while Ridley covered her tracks or called in favors from influential supporters. But he also knew that pushing too hard without proper backup could backfire. If Ridley's benefactors were as powerful as she claimed, they could indeed cause problems for him and potentially shut down the investigation entirely. "Very well," he said. "I'll return tomorrow morning at 9, but I'll also be visiting Sheriff Hoskins this evening to inquire about those missing girls. And I'll be sending a telegram to my superiors at the State Board of Charities requesting additional investigators and possibly law enforcement support. This situation is far more serious than a routine inspection." Ridley walked him to the door, her spine rigid, her face a mask of controlled fury. "You're making a terrible mistake, Mr. Brennan. These girls are damaged goods, the products of sin and corruption. No amount of investigation or reform will change their fundamental nature. All you'll accomplish is destroying the only refuge they have and condemning them to lives of degradation. Is that really what you want?" "What I want," Brennan said, "is to ensure that every child in Kentucky receives proper care and protection under the law. If Mercy Ridge is failing to provide that care, it will be shut down. And if crimes have been committed here, abuse, neglect, unlawful confinement, those responsible will face justice." He walked down the hill as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the path. Behind him, the orphanage loomed like a grey fortress, its windows dark and unwelcoming. He could hear singing from inside, the evening hymns Ridley had mentioned. The voices were thin and high, lacking any joy or enthusiasm. They sounded like prisoners singing at gunpoint. When Brennan reached Colebrook's Main Street, he went directly to the sheriff's office. Sheriff James Hoskins was a heavy-set man in his 50s with a tobacco-stained mustache and eyes that held the weary cynicism of someone who had seen too much of human nature's darker side. He listened to Brennan's account of the conditions at Mercy Ridge with an expression that shifted from boredom to irritation and finally to something resembling resignation. "Mrs. Ridley runs a tight operation up there," Hoskins said when Brennan finished. "I've never had any complaints from the girls themselves. A few runaways over the years, but that's normal for an orphanage. Kids get restless, think they know better than the adults caring for them. Usually they come crawling back within a few days, hungry and scared." "Did the runaways come back?" "The ones from 1897, 1898, 1899. Hoskins shifted in his chair. "Some of them did, others didn't. Like I said, runaways are common. We can't spend county resources tracking down every wayward girl who decides she doesn't like following rules." Brennan leaned forward. "Sheriff, I have testimony from a resident that 6 girls have died at Mercy Ridge in the past 3 years. 6 deaths. And they're all buried in unmarked graves behind the building. Does that seem normal to you?" "Kids die, especially ones who come from rough backgrounds, bad constitutions, weak blood. Mrs. Ridley's not a miracle worker. She does the best she can with what she's given." Hoskins pulled out a plug of tobacco and bit off a piece. "Look, Mr. Brennan, I understand you're just doing your job. But you need to understand something about this town and about Mercy Ridge. That orphanage serves a purpose. It takes girls that nobody else wants, girls that would otherwise end up dead or worse. Mrs. Ridley has connections to some very important people who support her work, people who don't appreciate outsiders coming in and stirring up trouble. Are you saying you won't investigate credible allegations of abuse and neglect? I'm saying I don't see any evidence of criminal activity. You've got the word of one troubled girl against the reputation of an institution that's been operating for 7 years without incident. If you want to make accusations, you better have more than that." Brennan stood abruptly. "I'll have more. I'm returning to Mercy Ridge tomorrow morning with documentation requirements and interview protocols, and I'll be requesting support from state authorities. If you choose not to fulfill your duties as sheriff, That will be noted in my report. Hoskins spat tobacco juice into a dented spittoon. You do what you need to do, but don't say I didn't warn you. Powerful people don't like their business made public, and Mrs. Ridley's business involves a lot of powerful people. Brennan left the sheriff's office and walked to the telegraph office. He composed a detailed message to his supervisor at the State Board of Charities, outlining what he had discovered and requesting immediate assistance. The telegram operator, a thin young man with ink-stained fingers, read it over and gave Brennan a strange look. "You investigating Mercy Ridge?" he asked. "Yes. Why?" The operator glanced around to make sure they were alone. "My sister worked up there 3 years ago. She was hired as an assistant matron, helping with laundry and cooking. She quit after 2 months, said she couldn't stand what she saw. Girls being beaten for the smallest infractions. Children locked in the cellar for days. One girl who had bruises all over her back from a strap. My sister tried to report it to the sheriff, but he told her to mind her own business. Said Mrs. Ridley had important friends and my sister was just causing trouble. What's your sister's name? Would she be willing to testify to what she saw? Martha Crenshaw. She lives about 5 miles out of town now, married to a farmer. I don't know if she'd testify. She was pretty shaken up by the whole thing, and she's got a family to think about. But I can ask her. Brennan wrote down the address. Please do, tell her it's important. Tell her other girls might die if we don't stop what's happening up there. That night, Brennan took a room at Colebrook's only hotel, a sagging 2-story building that smelled of mildew and fried onions. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Sarah's pale face and frightened eyes. He thought about the 6 graves behind the orphanage, the girls who had died because they were deemed too weak or too damaged to save. He thought about the missing girls whose fates remained unknown. At dawn, he dressed and prepared to return to Mercy Ridge. But when he opened his hotel room door, he found Sheriff Hoskins standing in the hallway with 2 deputies. "Mr. Brennan, I need you to come with me," Hoskins said. "What's this about?" "There was a fire at Mercy Ridge last night. The building burned to the ground. Mrs. Ridley says it was arson, that you threatened her yesterday and said you'd shut down the orphanage. She's filed charges against you." Brennan's blood ran cold. "That's absurd. I left Mercy Ridge at sunset and came directly to town. Where are the girls? Were any of them hurt?" "Mrs. Ridley and her staff got all the girls out safely. They're being temporarily housed in the Baptist church. But the building's a total loss. All the records, everything gone." It was too convenient. Brennan knew immediately what had happened. Ridley had burned down the orphanage herself to destroy the evidence of her crimes. The ledgers, the admission records, the financial documentation, all of it was now ash. And by accusing him of arson, she was attempting to discredit his investigation before it could proceed further. "Sheriff, you need to question the girls, privately away from Mrs. Ridley. They'll tell you what really happened, and I want to examine the fire site. If this was arson, a proper investigation will determine who set it." Hoskins scratched his jaw. "Maybe you're right, but for now, you're coming with me. We'll sort this out at the office." It took 3 days, 3 days of telegrams back and forth with the State Board of Charities, depositions from Brennan documenting his whereabouts, and finally, reluctant testimony from 2 of the girls who admitted that they saw Mrs. Ridley and Miss Howell carrying lanterns into the administrative wing late at night, just before the fire started. The girls were terrified to speak, but one of them, Sarah, found the courage to tell the truth. The charges against Brennan were dropped. Mrs. Ridley was arrested for arson, fraud, and child endangerment. Dr. Caldwell was arrested for falsifying death certificates. And over the following months, as investigators dug deeper, they uncovered the full scope of the operation. Mercy Ridge had been a dumping ground for the illegitimate children of Kentucky's elite, men who paid Ridley substantial sums to hide their indiscretions. The girls were exploited as unpaid labor, and when they became too old or too difficult to manage, they disappeared. Some had been placed in brothels or sweatshops, others had simply vanished. The 6 graves behind the orphanage were exhumed. The remains confirmed that all 6 girls had died from preventable causes: pneumonia, malnutrition, untreated infections. Their deaths were ruled homicides by neglect. The trial of Constance Ridley drew national attention. Newspapers across the country carried stories about the Devil's Daughters case. The Girls' Society had marked as irredeemable, and the woman who had profited from their suffering. Several prominent Kentucky men were exposed as fathers who had paid to hide their children. Some lost their positions and reputations. Others used their wealth and influence to escape serious consequences. Ridley was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison. She showed no remorse during the trial, insisting until the end that she had been providing a necessary service. The girls of Mercy Ridge were dispersed to other institutions, better ones, Brennan hoped. Sarah was placed with a family in Louisville who treated her kindly. She learned to read and write, and years later, she became a teacher. She never forgot the girls who died at Mercy Ridge, and she spent her life advocating for better protections for vulnerable children. Thomas Brennan continued his work as an inspector, but the Mercy Ridge case changed him. He became more aggressive in his investigations, less willing to accept surface explanations. He pushed for reforms in Kentucky's orphanage system, and eventually his efforts led to new laws requiring regular inspections, proper documentation, and criminal penalties for institutional abuse. The site where Mercy Ridge once stood remained empty for decades. No one wanted to build on ground where so much suffering had occurred. Eventually, in 1947, a small memorial was erected there, a granite stone engraved with the names of the 6 girls who died and the words "The Children's Society Forgot." May they finally rest in peace. The Devil's daughters were daughters of circumstance and misfortune, not of evil. Their story stands as a reminder that society's judgment can be more cruel than any supernatural curse, and that the real monsters are often those who hide behind respectability and righteousness while exploiting the most vulnerable among us. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.